Welcome back to the channel. So this battle in miniature is all about the Battle of Cannae. Now I always start these videos with an apology about pronunciations. If I get something wrong, I do apologise. So the Battle of Cannae, one of the finest victories in the history of warfare. It's taught to strategists today and actually was a double envelopment and total destruction of a Roman army. So what I'm going to do today is give a bit of an overview of the Roman army, a bit of an overview of the Carthaginian army, then to the battlefield where I'll talk you through the action helped by my ancient armies. These are 6mm ancient armies in front of us. So in context, the Battle of Cannae comes during the Second Punic War. The year is 216 BC and Carthage, spurred on by the House of Barca, started a war to reclaim its lost prestige from the First Punic War and to stop Roman expansion into their holdings in Spain. And famously, before this battle, Hannibal Barca, leader of the Carthaginian forces, had crossed the Alps and took the war into northern Italy. Preceding Cannae, there were two massive body blows that the Romans had taken at the battles of Lake Trasimene. I told you about my pronunciations, didn't I? And Trebia, and actually had to reform its legions to oppose the Carthaginians. However, at Cannae, it had the advantage in size, and it had brought Hannibal to the battlefield and a place of its choosing. On the sides of the armies, it's pretty hard to pin down exact numbers of troops, but the Romans definitely had the advantage in terms of infantry, at least a third again, maybe as much as 40% more infantry than Carthage, but Carthage had approximately double the cavalry that the Romans had. And certainly in the earlier battles I've mentioned, and Trebia, Carthaginian cavalry had been a deciding factor in those battles. So before we talk about the battle, let's discuss the armies involved. First, the Republic of Rome, SPQR. The army was part of the state, and as a citizen of Rome, you had obligations to serve in the army. Every March named after Mars, the god of war. Every March, those of eligible service were called up and the legions assembled. When you were selected to serve in the legion, you had 6 years service. Now, in the early days of the Republic, and certainly during peaceful times, that service would be 6 seasons and you would go back to Rome over winter. However, in prolonged conflict like you saw in the Punic Wars, the legions were probably formed as permanent organizations. Each year, consuls were elected to lead those armies. If those consuls stayed in post, they would prorogue the position, and that's where you get the title proconsul from. One of the advantages of that consular system was it was a system designed to stop people becoming dictators and tyrants in Rome. I know those terms had very specific legal definitions, but Rome was fearful of returning to the rule of kings. However, the disadvantage is you lose experienced commanders, and commanders leading armies, Rome had a succession of them. So that knowledge was not necessarily passed on the way it would be with other armies. Hannibal, for example, had been leading this Carthaginian army over several campaigns and knew its troops, knew his armies, knew its strengths well. So the Roman army was based around its legions, and its legions had 5 troop types. So I'm going to move the camera over to the Roman legions. 5 troop types. First one's the cavalry. It's worth noting at this point that the individual was expected to provide their equipment, not the state. So the Roman cavalry, obviously maintaining horses, arms and armour for being a cavalry, was expensive. So cavalry were formed from the richest property owners. Then came 4 distinct types of infantry. First off was the velites. And the velites were the skirmishers of the army. So, I mean, these are tiny men. It's not too tiny to show up at this scale, at this distance. So these were the ones traditionally associated wearing wolf skins, fighting a light formation, and the skirmishers' role was to oppose enemy skirmishers. Once the enemy skirmishers were seen off, hopefully you'd have enough skirmishers left to cause a bit of disruption to the enemy battle lines before you'd fall back and let the main heavy infantry do their work. I always see skirmishers and light infantry having more of an influence over campaigns where they can act as scouts and pickets rather than actually on the battlefield themselves. Now, as you'll see here, we've got 3 lines of Roman troops, and that's how the main legion would fight. This front line was known as the Hastii, and they were the least well-equipped troops. However, they formed the first line. The second line was the principals, again, more heavily armed in terms of equipment. And finally, the third line of troops, the Triarii. And they would form up in maniples. And a Roman legion would have 10 maniples of 140 men for the Hastii and the principals. And the Triarii had 10 maniples, but they were only of 60 men. So that would give a paper strength of approximately 5,000 infantry and 600 cavalry. The army is set up here, ready to refight the Battle of Cannae. So you see the cavalry on the wings, and they will be known as alae, which I think translates as wing. Hastii, principals, and Triarii. The Triarii weren't at the Battle of Cannae. They were left back at the camp. So I'm going to remove those from the battlefield. You'll also notice there's more Hastii than principals, and I said there was an equal number in the legions. Well, Rome also had allies in Italy. So at this point, Rome wasn't the entirety of Italy, and it was formed up of allied states, regions, and towns, which would also send troops. They would fight in a roughly Roman formation, but they weren't strictly technically Roman. The other innovation that the Romans had was the manipular checkerboard formation. So, as you see here, there's gaps between the troops, and what would happen is the front line would form up and fight, but then there's gaps, so the front line could retire back through and the second line form up in that battle line. And once the Hastii would finish their work, if they couldn't finish off the enemy and they had to fall back, they would fall back through the principals and they would take up the fight. The advantage there is you're able to rotate through different maniples of troop types and then different troop types. So an enemy which wasn't rotating their troops would tire out, whereas the Romans were constantly putting fresh troops to the fore, fresh troops to the fore, fresh troops to the fore. If the first line was defeated, the enemy troops, who's generally in tribal enemies, your best troops, your nobles would lead from the front. So your best troops were tired as they crashed into the second line of Roman principals. And then you've got better Roman troops fighting progressively worse and or tired enemy troops. And finally, if the enemy was so strong that the principals had to fall back, they fell back through the Triarii, the best heavily equipped troops in the Roman army. And it was the last line of defence, but a line that was expected to hold and win. Hence the phrase, it's all down to the Triarii. So that was the Roman army at the time. Now, the army of Carthage during the Second Punic War in northern Italy. So this is, again, set up ready for the Battle of Cannae. So Hannibal had a very varied and diverse force comprising 3 distinct elements. First off, it's worth thinking about how this army came together. A lot of it's down to diplomacy. So at its core was the North African troops, mercenaries, Spanish troops, also mercenaries and allies, and then the Gallic troops, which were also allies. And I'll talk about each one in a bit of detail. So even before we consider Hannibal's skills as a strategist and a tactician, it's also worth congratulating him on his skills as a diplomat and organizer. And actually, by all accounts, at times, Hannibal was a pretty driven man. And often driven men become quite abrasive, but the fact he was able to keep this army together for as long as it did speaks volumes for his abilities as a diplomat. But anyway, the three elements of the Carthaginian army. So first off is the rump of the troops that came from Africa. So these will be known as Libyan infantry. So we're looking at North Africa here. And Carthage was a city-state, a mercantile empire. So these were often mercenaries. It didn't really put out an army that hired mercenaries. I'm pretty sure by the end of the First Punic War, there was an incident where the mercenaries weren't getting paid properly and revolted against Carthage, which caused all sorts of problems. So these troops, the Carthage itself was a Phoenician state originally settled by Greek settlers, so would start out looking very Hellenistic, and the Libyan infantry probably started out as some sort of phalanxes, but as time went on, my belief is it would have become more spear-armed infantry, especially since the legions seem to be quite effective against phalanxes. Certainly after the battles I've talked about earlier, Trebia, and I won't try and pronounce it, the Lake Battle, again, I'll embarrass myself, the veterans of Hannibal's army were able to take the best equipment from the Romans and became more heavily equipped and armed and better equipped. Also from North Africa, and in this battle at the far wing of the Carthaginian cavalry, was Numidian horsemen. So light horsemen, some of the best horsemen in the world at the time, fighting for Carthage. And they had an excellent cavalry commander, Mahabal. Again, I do apologise for the pronunciations. And this was the core of the sort of North African contingent of Hannibal's army. But the Barca holdings were particularly strong in Spain, and certainly the army started out in Spain. So Hannibal set out with lots of Spanish allies, which also provided more heavy and light infantry, most notably the Spanish Scutari, which were named after the shields, and heavy horsemen. Generally in more tribal environments, as I said before, the nobles fought at the fronts of formations. They also formed the heavy cavalry. Now this army, the Spanish and North African elements, had crossed the Alps famously to take the Romans by surprise, and it was a brutal crossing with much desertions of troops and attrition of troops. Up to half his army perished and most of his elephants perished. You will notice in this battle there are no Carthaginian elephants, which Carthage was famous for. And actually Hannibal seemed okay with this because he knew the troops that were left would be the toughest, hardest, most capable and most determined troops, the best troops you'd want in your army, as opposed to, say, unwilling or uncertain Spanish allies. These were the guys who were fully committed to the cause. Now, across the Alps, Hannibal was able to make contact with the Cisalpine Gauls living in northern Italy. Now, the Gauls have fought with Rome many times, and they came and swelled the ranks of the Carthaginian army, with tribal warriors and more heavy cavalry again. The previous Carthage victories would only encourage more Gauls to be attracted through the promise of, fighting their ancient enemies, the Romans, and more plunder. So now we come to the battle itself. So the Roman army, as it says before, the Triarii were off at the camp. It's worth I'll go zoom out and show the battlefield. So the battlefield, I've got sort of a deserty cloth right now. Actually, the battle was in the green fields of northern Italy. Just my green cloth is elsewhere at the moment. It was fought on the banks of a river. Now the Roman army under consuls Paulus and Varus, even though I mentioned before the difference in the army commanders and consuls and learning and leadership, it seems to me the Romans at this point had learned some valuable lessons from the earlier defeats at the hands of the Carthaginians, especially at Trebia. What happened at Trebia was the Roman infantry were able to punch through the middle of the Carthaginian line. the Carthaginian cavalry were able to sweep the flanks and surround the Roman legions and cause trouble and defeat the Roman army. This was also aided by Hannibal's brother Magos being able to launch a surprise attack with some hidden troops in ambush. So what the Romans did, and they were able to choose this battleground, was one flank was guarded by a river, and the Romans were able to put some cavalry there. It had an advantage in infantry, and what they did with the maniples was, rather than having them wider than deeper, they deployed the maniples deeper. The idea being that their superiority in infantry would be able to push through the Carthaginian line. Now, in terms of cavalry, about a third of the cavalry was the ones closest to the river, whereas the rest of the cavalry out at the flank. And the hope was that the cavalry would be able to hold off the Carthaginian cavalry while the infantry destroyed the Carthaginian infantry in the middle, and victory would be theirs. To further aid this, the two generals, Paulus and Varus, actually deployed with the cavalry on the wings. So the Romans, Paulus, I can imagine him looking at the Carthaginian deployment and rubbing his hands with glee. So if we think about what the Roman commanders would see, is the Carthaginian army deployed like this. So as you can see, the Carthaginian army are deployed in this crescent formation. Now this is a very defensive formation. One of the advantages of this is if you had troops and reserves in the middle, it's easier to move to either side, and the enemy attacker will contact but then have to move, and their lines would buckle outwards. So I can imagine a Roman commander thinking that Hannibal is prepared to fight a defensive battle, and often defensive battles involve you reacting to the enemy as opposed to your dominating the pace of battle. However, Hannibal had his own plans. And it was basically a repeat of the Battle of Trebia. And one of the real skills of Hannibal is, if we look at Sun Tzu, in his Art of War, he says, know your enemy, know yourself, and within 1,000 battles you will not be defeated. And Hannibal knew his enemy, and he knew his army, and he's laid his plan appropriately. So if we look at Hannibal's plan, he obviously has the advantage in cavalry, and he has his main heavy cavalry by the river. Now he knew this cavalry would need to break through the Roman lines, but he massed his heavy cavalry, knowing that if any of his cavalry could, it would be his heavy cavalry. Now the troops in the middle, his tribal Gauls and Spaniards, would be holding the centre of the line, and he expected them to be pushed back by the weight of the Roman advance. However, if you'll notice on each flank, he put his elite heavy Libyan infantry. The idea being, as the Romans advanced through the centre here and pushed the Gauls back, his infantry would be able to act as a vice on the Roman flanks, and his cavalry hopefully would have pushed round behind, encircled the Roman army, and as the Roman army used its strength to push forward, Hannibal would use that strength against it to end up encircling and destroying the Roman army. On his far flank was his Numidian cavalry, facing off against the Roman cavalry. Now, Hannibal needed his Gauls and his Spaniards to fight. He couldn't tell his troops the full battle plan. Troops who know that they're expected to fall back, and morale is a fickle thing in war. He needed his troops to fight. It couldn't be too easy for the Romans to advance and push through the centre. So actually Hannibal himself was in the centre, and he would be able to move up and down his line and push back the troops. Not push back the troops, inspire the troops to stand and fight and resist the Romans. So let's see how the battle started and went on. So expected, the skirmishers would fight in the middle. The Carthaginians did seem to have the upper hand with the skirmishers. As the skirmishers were fighting, the cavalry advanced and started their fight. Now, as the cavalry fought, it is said that a Balearic slinger actually wounded the Roman commander Paulus. And Paulus then joined his infantry. So we're imagining now the skirmishing has gone off. The Carthage has probably had the advantage in skirmishes. The skirmishers would fall back and wait till the end of the battle. And I'm imagining light infantry being able to cover retreats if needed, or cover pursuit of the enemy, light cavalry and light infantry pursuing the enemy. And actually, in ancient warfare, battlefield casualties caused by the actual clash of arms were relatively light compared to the overall casualties caused by a battle, because what would happen is, as a force fled, that's when most troops would be captured and killed as their discipline failed and the morale broke. Right, I'm going to move to behind the Romans as we start to see the Roman advance. So we'll remove all the light infantry now. So the cavalry on this flank, the Numidians were expert horsemen, and being light horsemen, what the Numidians would do would ride up, unleash their javelins at the enemy and ride back again. So that would be keeping the Roman cavalry on this flank under the command of Varus occupied. I'm going to pull the Carthaginians forward a bit, just so I'm not reaching all the way to the back as the battle unfolds. So the Romans, front line would form up a solid front line with the manipular formation behind. And as we see, as the line would advance, it will contact. And push up. What then would start to happen, or did happen, is the Carthaginian line is pushed back. Ancient battles would start to become a bit of a clash of melees, confusing melees, but the Romans are pushing forward. Pushing forward. Carthage as we can see now, push back. The Romans are starting to get sucked into this forward momentum. And actually that forward momentum is what Paulus wanted to occur. He wanted his Roman infantry to utterly crush the Carthaginian infantry in the middle. However, what starts happening is this melee here with the cavalry. This is a brutal melee, but the Carthaginian have the advantage in numbers and the Roman cavalry breaks. The Romans are pushing forward still. I'll assemble some lines. Those deep manipular formations now starting to wear down and push back the Carthaginian front line. However, what starts to happen more and more is the Carthaginians are pushed back into a reverse formation. Whereas they had the crescent out, they've got the crescent starting to push back. Paulus at this point must be pretty delighted. His plan seems to be working. The Carthaginian army seems to be buckling and breaking. He won't know at this point that his cavalry is broken. Some of the Carthaginian cavalry chase off the enemy cavalry. Some of it comes around behind. On this flank, the Numidian cavalry end up stop skirmishing at this point and drive off the Roman cavalry, again with some of its cavalry coming around behind the Romans. The Roman infantry keep pushing forward. Then what happens is the Libyan infantry are released on the flanks and start pushing into the Romans. The cavalry come up behind the Romans. The Romans are now encircled and push back on themselves. Reports say the crush of Roman troops was so much that at times they could barely lift their weapons. However, any general will tell you being totally encircled by the enemy armies was never going to be a good thing. Especially cavalry in the rear, the Roman army started to disintegrate, fall down, and the Roman army was at this point lost. The slaughter was to begin. Now, we talked about in ancient battles, a lot of the slaughter would occur as an army fell away, and light cavalry and light infantry would harry and harass them. That wasn't the case. This was just a brutal battlefield slaughter. It is estimated that Roman losses were around 40,000 with up to 20,000 men captured. Hannibal's victory came at the cost of 8,000 dead. 8,000 dead's a large amount of troops, don't get me wrong, but compared to the Roman losses and the loss of a Roman army, and again the loss of a Roman prestige, was almost unheralded. You know, for an army, for a nation to have three such severe defeats says a lot for the staying power of Rome to be able to stay in the field against the Second Punic War. And actually, the campaign would go on, and the Roman adopted something called the Fabian strategy, which would be them denying Hannibal fighting on the battlefield. They would, in Rome, in Italy itself, and Hannibal just didn't have the troops to make an effective use of sieges. Hannibal tried to get the Roman allies to peel away from Rome. That never really materialized in the numbers that Hannibal needed. In the meantime, Scipio had gone to Spain and was attacking Carthaginian holdings in Spain, and the Carthaginian elders, council, were limiting how much supplies were getting through to Hannibal. Hannibal was winning so much that it was, do you give your supplies to the front that is struggling, or the front that is winning handsomely? And Hannibal just could not bring Rome to its knees. And eventually, again, Rome was to win the Second Punic War. It's amazing. I always look at the early defeats of Rome in the Second Punic War, and I find it amazing that they were able to come back and defeat Carthage. But what we've seen is the defeat of a Roman army. Hannibal knew his troops, knew his strength, knew that his Gauls and his Spanish troops would hold the Romans just long enough for his cavalry to complete the encirclement. He knew that the Romans would push forward and that momentum would push his army back, so he stationed his Libyan troops on the flanks to swing round and support that encirclement. Faith, confidence, knowledge of yourself, knowledge of your enemy, and 1,000 battles you'll never be defeated. But that was the Battle of Cannae in miniature. Hope you've enjoyed this. I've got plans to do some other battles coming up soon, and hope you're having a great time with your hobbies and interests at the moment, and I look forward to speaking to you again. If you've got any thoughts or insights on the Battle of Cannae, I'd be really interested to hear them in the comment section. But anyway, that is goodbye for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again. Goodbye.